What if America invaded Russia right now? At the time of writing for this video, the whole world is watching Eastern Europe incredibly carefully as over 100,000 Russian troops have been amassed alongside the eastern border of Ukraine, causing a tidal wave of debate across the globe as to whether Vladimir Putin is actually planning to invade Ukraine or whether this is merely more saber-rattling as Russia attempts to gain concessions from NATO and other Western nations. While many NATO-allied nations have begun making preparations to invoke sanctions against Russia if they continue their aggression, many are waiting to see exactly how committed Putin is to his potential invasion plan. And although American President Joe Biden has claimed that no American troops will be sent into Ukraine in a combat role, is there a possibility that America could invade Russia before Russia can harm Ukraine? The answer is a bit more complicated than you might think. The United States and Russia, formerly known as the Soviet Union, have a long and complicated history as the two biggest superpowers on the global stage following the end of the Second World War. For decades, the two were locked in a Cold War based around their competing ideologies and the growing threat of both sides having a sizable nuclear stockpile. This was the whole reasoning behind the coldness of the Cold War in the first place. Neither side wanted to be the first to use nuclear arms against the other because it would likely lead to mutually assured destruction as both sides would be forced to unleash their salvos of stored nuclear weapons. And while the threat of mutually assured destruction has become much lower since the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia's resurgence as a singular country again, the United States and Russia are still opposed to one another after so many decades of being tense enemies. If America were to suddenly attempt to invade Russia itself, they'd be breaking almost a century's worth of precedent and begin a war that would be the farthest thing from cold, even if nuclear weapons likely wouldn't be invoked. The first issue with the United States of America attempting to invade the Russian mainland is a matter of distance. There's over 7,100 kilometers, or 4,400 miles, between the continental US and the border of Russia, with the Atlantic Ocean and the rest of Europe making up the bulk of that incredibly long distance. Ironically, if America decided to invade from the opposite direction over the Pacific Ocean, they'd have a slightly shorter distance of 6,600 kilometers or 4,100 miles, but given that the entirety of that distance would be over the ocean, it would be extremely impractical to launch any attacks over such a distance. If the United States wanted to get any actual boots on the ground in Russia, they would likely be forced to rely heavily on allied military bases throughout Europe and Asia, with tens of thousands of troops already stationed in South Korea and the Persian Gulf countries that could be used to quickly launch an attack on Russia. However, any country that allowed US troops to launch directly from their soil would also risk angering Russia further and might get pulled into the conflict more heavily than our allies would like. Attacking Russia during the wintertime is notoriously difficult even under ideal circumstances, and having to negotiate a starting base of operations and which countries would be willing to fully engage in war with Russia would be a huge diplomatic hurdle that the United States would have to find a way to deal with. And any countries in the region that aren't necessarily the most friendly with the United States might take issue with the US suddenly rolling thousands of troops and equipment through on their way to Russia, thus causing even more problems than the United States would have to contend with. Now, the main expectation if any actual fighting breaks out in Eastern Europe is that it would mostly center on Ukraine itself, given that Russia's been amassing troops and technology on their border for several months now. However, the United States invading Russia directly would be tremendously unexpected, given how difficult a direct attack on Russia would be, but it might have some advantages to simply fighting within Ukraine. If the United States were able to attack key Russian infrastructure before Russia was fully aware they were being invaded, the United States might be able to take advantage of the fact that many of Russia's troops are currently focused on preparing for their own invasion of Ukraine. The United States likely would need to supply some troops directly to Ukraine to make sure that Russia didn't make their own aggressive move in the area, but their main focus would be getting as many special forces forces and tactical units into Russia as undetected as possible. However, in a world of 5G internet and satellite surveillance, getting armed troops into a country without being detected is far easier said than done. Furthermore, while Russia's defenses wouldn't be at their peak due to 100,000 troops being actively involved in preparing for invasion on Ukraine's borders, this still leaves 750,000 active members in the Russian military that could be called upon to fall back and defend the country if an American attack were to suddenly take place or an American invasion attempted. The United States would need to commit an absolutely massive amount of troops, equipment, and technology if it wanted to have any hope of securing a foothold on even the very edge of Russian territory, which would be made all the more difficult by the fact that much of this equipment would need to be airlifted, utilizing the entirety of the US Air Force's transportation forces simply to get anything noteworthy on the ground. Combine this with the active threat that would be posed to any American aircraft by Russian defenses and rockets, and you have a situation that could snowball into disaster and stranded American troops incredibly quickly. The United States might currently have 1.3 million active personnel in their military, but that large number would mean nothing when it comes to an invasion if they couldn't safely get those troops within firing distance of Russia. Combined with anti-war and support the troops sentiments conflicting at home, and the United States might have a lot more to lose from an outright invasion of Russia than it would ever have to gain. At the end of the day, the situation going on in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine is a very serious one, and it's a situation that we can only hope won't result in bloodshed or the loss of further land for the Ukraine people. While a full-out invasion of Russia committed by the United States is an extremely unlikely possibility given the current tactics being used by NATO members and Joe Biden's commitment to not using American troops for combat during this standoff, it's still an interesting possibility to think and talk about and wonder just how such a radical plan would play out. So if you enjoyed this video and the topic of discussion, be sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and let us know down in the comments what sorts of videos you'd like to see next. As always, this has been Life's Biggest Questions, and we'll see you all next time.